Good morning, students. In continuation of the last class, I will talk about the stretch reflex, different aspects of the stretch reflex, how the stretch reflex is initiated, and what is the utility of the stretch reflex. Now, this picture, as I drew in the last class, is the picture which depicts the reflex pathway of the stretch reflex. That is the muscle spindle, which is the receptor, then the 1A and the 2 afferents, which are going to the spinal cord, making a single synaptic connection with the alpha motor neuron of that spinal cord segment, and from the alpha motor neuron the motor neurons are coming to supply the extrafusal muscle of the same muscle from which the stimulus originated, right? So this reflex, whenever a muscle is stretched, it responds by contraction. This reflex is the stretch reflex, as I told you, monosynaptic reflex or MSR, as I told you, because only a single synapse is involved in the whole pathway, or it is also known as the reflex of its own kind, which is the only single monosynaptic reflex present in our body. Other reflexes are either bisynaptic or polysynaptic. So this is the only monosynaptic reflex. Stretch reflex is the only monosynaptic reflex which is present in our biological system. Now we will see today how this spindle, muscle spindle or the receptor is stimulated. Now the stimulation of the receptor is also known as the spindle loading. Spindle loading. So what is spindle loading? Spindle loading equals receptor stimulation. Now what is the stimulus which acts over here? That is a stretching of the central portion of the muscle spindle. This is the central portion of both the nuclear chain fiber and the back fiber. Whenever they are stretched, they respond by contraction. So spindle loading means receptor stimulation, or more precisely stretching of the central or equatorial portion of the intrafusal fibers. Central or equatorial portion of the intrafusal fibers. That means spindle loading. Now let us see how the spindle loading takes place. Mechanism of spindle loading. Spindle loading means muscle spindle stimulation or receptor stimulation. This should be kept in mind. This is very important. Now this loading can occur by two means. One is mechanical and second one is neural. Now we shall talk about the mechanical first. What is the mechanical stimulation of the spindle? Now whenever a muscle is stretched, by mechanical means, either by stretching the muscle, which the athletes do in their routine practice, or by striking the tendon of the muscle. By striking the tendon of the muscle, if this be the tendon of the muscle attached to a bone, so this is the muscle tendon, and the tendon is connected to the extrafusal muscle fibers, because the extrafusal muscle fibers by means of the tendon takes attachment to the bone concerned. This is a normal anatomy of any skeletal muscle whatsoever, that the extrafusal muscle fibers by means of a tendon is attached to a nearby bone. Skeletal muscle, so it must be attached to the bone. Is this clear? So whenever this tendon is struck by a hammer, which you will have to do in your practical class, when the tendon is struck by a hammer, say for example at this place, when the tendon is struck by a hammer, then what happens? There is stretching of the tendon, and as a result of anatomical continuation of the tendon with the extrafusal muscle fibers, the extrafusal muscle fibers are also stretched, and as the muscle spindle, that is the both nuclear chain fiber and the back fiber, attached at its periphery with the extrafusal muscle fiber, as I told you, is signified by these solid dots at the two ends. As the extrafusal muscle fibers are attached to the interfusal muscle fibers at their periphery, there will be also stretching of the interfusal muscle fiber or muscle spindle. Right? Mechanical stimulation. You are striking the tendon by a percussion hammer. So there will be stimulation of the extrafusal muscle fibers, leading to stretching of the interfusal muscle fibers, and this stretching is maximally present at the central equatorial region, because the elastic fibers, as I told you, are present in the central region, but the muscular fibers are present at its periphery, where the compliance is low. So if the fibers, back fiber and the chain fibers are stretched, the stretch will be maximally effective on the central or equatorial region of the muscle spindle. So there will be stimulation, stretching of this central or equatorial region, and the afferent impulse by the 1A fiber, very very important, because the central region of both back and the chain fibers, they give origin to the 1A fibers, 1A afferent, right? This is the 1A afferent, and this is the 2 afferent. So 1A afferent will carry the sensation of stretching from the central region, and as a result of which it will go to the spinal segment after relaying into the dorsal root ganglion, and will make a synaptic connection with the alpha motor neuron, and there will be discharge from the alpha motor neuron, which will come to the extrafusal muscle fibers. Extrafusal muscle fibers will contract now, and as a result of contraction and as a result of anatomical continuity between the extrafusal fiber and the interfusal fibers, there will be also collapsing of the interfusal fibers, leading to release of the stretch from the equatorial or the central region of the muscle spindle. So it is contracting extrafusal muscle fiber. As a result of anatomical continuation, this is also getting shortened, and as a result of shortening of the muscle spindle or the interfusal muscle fibers, the central stretching will be abolished. So there will be no further stimulation arising from the equatorial or central region, and the reflex will stop. But by that time the motto is achieved, because the basic motto of the stretch reflex is to maintain the length of the muscle fiber. So during the strike of the tendon by the hammer, there was stretching of the tendon, there was stretching of the extrafusal muscle fibers, there was increment of the length of the extrafusal muscle fibers to bring that length back to the normal position. What will happen? There will be setting of the monosynaptic reflex or the stretch reflex, as a result of which there will be contraction of the extrafusal muscle fibers, and there will be relaxation of the muscle spindle too, releasing the stretch from the central region, and as a result there will be stoppage of this monosynaptic reflex or the stretch reflex. This stimulation of the central region of the nuclear bag and the chain fiber is known as the muscle spindle loading. Loading means stretching or receptor stimulation in this case. Is this clear? So this is the mechanical means. Mechanical, you are striking the tendon by the hammer, which you will have to do in your practical class. Okay. Now the neural. Second mechanism is neural. There is no question of any mechanical force to be applied on the muscle. It is the neural. Neural means what? What neurons are supplying the muscle spindle? What motor neurons are supplying the muscle spindle? The gamma 1 and the gamma 2. They are supplying the peripheral muscular portion of both the nuclear chain fiber and the bag fiber. These striated regions represent the peripheral muscular portion of both the nuclear bag and the chain fibers. So whenever there is increased discharge from the gamma motor neuron, gamma 1 or gamma 2, gamma dynamic or gamma static, as I told you in the last class, so there will be contraction of the peripheral portion of the nuclear bag and the chain fibers. So what will ultimately happen? If the peripheral part contracts, they will try to stretch the central equatorial region. They will try to stretch the central equatorial region because the central equatorial region is full of elastic components and the compliance is very, very high. There is no muscular element at the central portion. The muscular elements are present only on the peripheral portion. So when there is increased gamma discharge from the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, what will happen? There will be contraction of the peripheral portion of the nuclear bag and the chain fibers, and as a result of contraction of the peripheral portion of the nuclear bag and the chain fibers, there will be stretching of the central equatorial region of the muscle spindle, and there will be setting up of the monosynaptic reflex or the stretch reflex, identically with that of the mechanical stimulus, what I told about the mechanical stimulus. Is this clear? So this is the neural mechanism. Why neural? Because it is due to the gamma motor discharge. This loading of the spindle is due to the gamma efferent discharge. So there are two basic mechanisms of spindle loading. One is the mechanical, striking the tendon, which is done practically in the medicine and the neurology departments, as well as in our departments also. You shall have to do it at the time of examination. Another is the increased gamma discharge, and that gamma discharge is once again controlled by the superior control coming from the cerebral cortex and the brainstem. That is altogether a different chapter. I will discuss later on. So that is about the spindle loading. Then if there is loading, there must be unloading. What is unloading? Spindle unloading. First, what is the meaning of the term spindle unloading? Very easy. If the loading is stretching, the unloading will be de-stretching, loss of stretching, termination of stretching, or more precisely de-stretching. How does that occur? Very easy. Whenever there is increased alpha motor discharge to the extrafusal muscle fibers, increased alpha motor discharge to the extrafusal muscle fibers, there is contraction of the extrafusal muscle fibers. As a result of, there is shortening of the extrafusal muscle fibers. As the extrafusal muscle fibers are attached peripherally with the intrafusal muscle fibers of the muscle spindle, there will be shortening of the interfusal muscle fibers too, and there will be release of the stretching which was present at the central equatorial region of the muscle spindle. So unloading is due to alpha motor discharge. It is very easy to remember and it is very interesting. Gamma motor discharge leads to loading of the muscle spindle, whereas alpha motor discharge leads to unloading of the muscle spindle. And if there is unloading of the muscle spindle, de-stretching of the muscle spindle, there will be immediate termination of the stretch reflex. It will be stopped. And that is the mechanism by which the stretch reflex operates. It operates to maintain length of the muscle fiber. Is this clear to you? Spindle loading and spindle unloading. Now, what is static response and what is dynamic response? These two things you shall have to consider. Static response of the spindle means whenever the spindle is stretching, as a result of the completion of the stretching, we will consider the total amount of stretching. That is the static response, which is usually carried by the two afferent fibers. So it is a domain of the nuclear chain fiber only. তাহলে static response of the spindle by two afferent fibers. And it signifies the total amount of stretching. Say for example, before stretching there was a length of the interfusion muscle fiber, and after the stretching is completed it achieves a new length. So the final length minus the initial length will be the total amount of stretching, and that is sensed by the two afferent fibers, and the impulse is sent to the central nervous system for consideration. Then what is dynamic response? Now dynamic response means it is the rate of change of stretching. The stretching occurs over there. The stretching may be a slow one, the stretching may be a moderate one, the stretching may be a very rapid one. So it is the rate of change of stretching is considered as the dynamic response. This is very important. That's why the two nerve supplies are there. It is definitely done by 1A afferent fiber. So this 1A afferent fibers, as both the fibers, that is the interfusal and the chain fiber and the back fibers are supplied by the 1A fiber, so the dynamic response is mediated by both the nuclear chain fiber as well as the back fiber, and is executed via the 1A afferent neuron to be brought to the central nervous system. So that is all about the static and the dynamic response. Similarly, for gamma dynamic and the gamma test static, same thing happens over here during the neural mechanism of the stimulation of the muscle spindle. Identically. This is about the sensory stimulus, that is the 2 and the 1A, static and the dynamic response. Gamma fibers are also, there is no partiality of the nature. The nature, if it gives two sensory supply to a particular structure, it must give two motor supply to a particular structure too. Here also there is a gamma 1 or gamma dynamic fiber responsible for the dynamic stimulation neurally of the muscle spindle, and there is a gamma 2 or gamma static fiber responsible for supplying the nuclear chain fiber only. Here you have seen it's the gamma dynamic is supplying the nuclear back fiber, and gamma static supplies the nuclear chain fiber. So whenever there will be neural stimulation of the muscle spindle is considered, the gamma 1 fiber or gamma dynamic fiber is responsible for the dynamic stimulation of the muscle spindle, and gamma 2 or gamma static fiber is responsible for the static neural stimulation of the muscle spindle. This is the difference between the static response or dynamic response, both as the sensory supply is concerned as well as the motor supply is concerned. Is this clear to you? Now we shall talk about another important reflex, that is the long loop stretch reflex. Long loop stretch reflex. What is that long loop stretch reflex? This is another important stretch reflex apart from the classical stretch reflex or monosynaptic reflex. This long loop stretch reflex also participates in the maintenance of the length of the muscle fiber, but it is a polysynaptic pathway and its center lies in the cerebral cortex. That is important. You just know about this reflex, not so important for your purpose, but still you shall have to know because they may ask you at the time of examination. So long loop stretch reflex is another stretch reflex which is multisynaptic. This is monosynaptic. Multisynaptic cortical reflex. This is monosynaptic spinal reflex and this is multisynaptic cortical reflex. It starts operating whenever the stretch reflex fails to maintain the length of the muscle fiber. There are some conditions where the stretch reflex may fail to maintain the length of the muscle fiber or to bring about the adequate contraction of the muscle concerned. In that case, the case is referred to the hierarchy. There is a supreme authority, that is the cerebral cortex, from where a reflex comes to control the length of the muscle fiber so that the desired muscle contraction is produced and the goal is achieved. So this is long loop stretch reflex. Along with classical stretch reflex, you must remember what is long loop stretch reflex. This is a cortical reflex, this is a multisynaptic reflex, and it operates whenever the classical or conventional stretch reflex fails to produce the desired contraction of the muscle fiber. So that's all for today.